A man after God's own heart once wrote, "I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping." That's not a throwaway line. That's a king, a warrior, a worship leader, someone Scripture calls beloved by God, describing something that sounds a lot like clinical depression in his own words, thousands of years before the term even existed. If David could write that and still be called a man after God's own heart, maybe depression was never a sign of spiritual failure. Today, we're going deep into David's Psalms, the raw, unfiltered ones, to see exactly what they teach us about mental health and about a God who apparently wasn't shocked by any of it. Depression, psychologically speaking, is more than sadness. It often includes persistent low mood, loss of interest in things that used to bring joy, disrupted sleep, physical heaviness or fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, and sometimes a sense that relief will never come. One of the most important things to understand is that depression doesn't require an obvious external cause. It can follow loss, yes, but it can also arrive during seasons of apparent success, faith, or stability, seemingly without warning. This is part of what makes it so disorienting. It doesn't always make logical sense from the outside. What's remarkable is how closely David's own words in the Psalms map onto this clinical picture, not vague spiritual language, but specific, embodied descriptions of what we now recognize as depressive symptoms. Let's walk through several Psalms, because the pattern across them is more powerful than any single verse alone. In Psalm 6, David describes being worn out from groaning, flooding his bed with tears nightly, and his eyes growing weak with sorrow. This isn't poetic exaggeration for effect. It mirrors the physical exhaustion and disrupted sleep common in depressive episodes. In Psalm 13, he asks, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever?" repeating the phrase "how long" 4 times in just a few verses. That repetition reflects something psychologists now recognize clearly: the sense of time, distortion, and hopelessness that depression creates, where relief feels impossibly far away, even when it isn't. In Psalm 22, the same psalm Jesus quotes from the cross, David writes, my God, why have you forsaken me?" alongside descriptions of feeling poured out, disconnected from his own body, and surrounded, yet utterly alone. This captures something depression often does. It isolates you even in the middle of community, even in the middle of faith itself. And in Psalm 42, likely written by someone close to David's circle, we get the haunting question, "Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me?" Someone literally interrogating their own inner state, trying to understand feelings that don't have an obvious explanation. That's strikingly close to how modern therapy encourages people to engage with their own emotions, naming them, questioning them, rather than suppressing them. What's notable across every one of these psalms is that none of them stay purely in despair, and none of them rush to force a resolution either. They sit in the difficulty, often for many verses, before any shift toward hope appears, and sometimes that shift is small, not triumphant. Here's why this matters so much. These psalms weren't hidden or edited out of Scripture. They were preserved, sung, and used in corporate worship for generations. The raw, unresolved, aching parts of David's experience were considered sacred enough to keep, not something to be ashamed of or erase. This tells us something important about how Scripture treats mental and emotional suffering. It doesn't sanitize it. It doesn't rush past it to get to a tidy resolution. It gives it space, language, and validation, modeling honest lament as a legitimate part of a life of faith, not a failure of one. It's also worth noting that David is never once told his feelings are evidence of weak faith. Not by God, not within the text itself. The Psalms of Lament sit right alongside the Psalms of Praise, as part of the same collection, the same relationship with God, not as a lesser, less faithful category. This pattern extends beyond David, too. Job describes wishing he'd never been born. Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, curses the day of his birth in chapter 20. Elijah, as we covered in a previous video, asks God to let him die after a burnout collapse. Even Jesus himself, in Gethsemane, says his soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Scripture doesn't present a single tone of constant triumphant faith. It presents deep honesty about suffering, sitting right alongside deep faith, not as contradictions, but as companions. The consistent thread is that God meets people in these lows directly, rather than waiting for them to perform their way out first. If David's words in these psalms resonated with something you're feeling, here's where to go from here. 1. Let your prayers be honest, not polished. David's Psalms model raw, unfiltered honesty with God as an act of faith, not a failure of it. 2. Don't rush your own healing timeline. Many of these Psalms sit in pain for several verses before any shift toward hope. Healing rarely follows a straight, quick line. 3. Seek both spiritual and professional support. David had prayer. He didn't have modern mental health treatment. You have access to both, and using both isn't a lack of faith. 4. Remember, lament is a form of worship, not a departure from it. These Psalms were preserved and sung publicly. Your honest struggle has a place in faith too, not just your triumphant moments. A man after God's own heart once flooded his bed with tears, and that story made it into scripture anyway. If this reminded you that honesty and faith can coexist, subscribe every week. We explore one mind and one scripture at a time. Let's grow together.